Well, welcome everybody, and for disclosure, none of us have any interest in anything here, right? That needs to be disclosed, I should say. So, again, I'm Tara Cunningham, and I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those maybe I've not met, I look forward to meeting and learning a little bit more. And my job today is just to share a little bit about the Student Affairs updates, and I'll take this from the lens of certainly what we learn at the annual AAMC Learn, Serve, Lead meeting, and then ongoing conversations that do set the landscape for what it is that we call student affairs within and across the country within medical education. I'll start first, and it segues to a previous conversation that our colleague Dr. Lauren Lankowski delivered on the complications and the implications of step one and the many steps that our students have to take. And so just to share nationally that every medical student affairs dean or medical student affairs dean is troubled about this time of the year, worrying about their students' wellness as the students progress through their second year, because they're facing what to be a career milestone in successfully planning, preparing for, and testing for step one of the medical student license or medical licensing board exam. I'll say that it's no surprise to those in this room that this is not only a progression to progress through medical school, but it's also a career-limiting decision and a career-limiting option or opportunity, rather, for students that have or do not have the magic number, whatever that number may be, dependent on the specialty. And so since the inception of this exam in 1992, and when it was being created, there was a lot of conversation about how do we score, how do we accurately represent the student's ability for future licensing exams when this is a just-in-time moment in their entire careers, and really only based on the first 2 years of medical school. And certainly there are models, some schools test after year 2, some schools are now testing after year 3, and some innovations in the space of preparing learners adequately for this monumental milestone in their medical education. But roughly a year ago, the national community of stakeholders, and that is representative of medical schools, graduate programs, program directors, those that are receiving our learners, in addition to the faculty and the students themselves that are part of the experience, to come together for another, which would be the third conversation about how do we appropriately assess and score step one, and then we'll also talk about step two, the clinical knowledge portion, and step two, clinical skills. And over the last year, 18 months has been, I think, a concerted effort that the community has responded well to, and ensuring that this is a broad-based, involved conversation for the stakeholders and then also members of the public. So I just marched out some of the timelines or the timeline that we certainly have experienced and have participated along the way. What's most exciting to me, and to hopefully 75% of the other medical school deans that said time is now to look at this, will be the recommendations coming out later this winter into the spring semester. And they range from no change to radical change. And I think anything in between is fair game. What is already being implemented, or will be implemented for the next testing cycle, is a more structured computerized exam scoring mechanism for step two, clinical skills, wherein for a portion of it has been human scored by those involved in the assessment of students during that clinical skills OSCE type examination. And so that's an improvement to tighten the score and to standardize a rubric by which learners are assessed and we can then help prepare students for. One of, in addition to that conversation, is broadening the examination tool, the assessment tool, to look beyond the academic readiness of a learner to be successful in future licensing exams, and broadening this to be what we'll call the non-cognitives, or the competency assessments. We talk a lot about what it means to be ethical, what it means to be professional, but are we assessing our learners in a developmental format over their career to predict and then ensure to our GME counterparts that we're sending them in good faith a whole and complete student that will now become an active member of a team? And so beyond the academics, paying attention to the assessment of competencies that we largely drill into, I think, quite nicely at admission. We assume they happen and that they continue to grow and develop, but then we have no real metric by which we are measuring those students as they exit and enter into the bridge into GME. And so these will be some of the ongoing efforts that are being had and discussed at this national level this international committee reviewing, or not international, but an invitational committee that's reviewing USMLE. So change is coming. We just don't know to what degree that change will be. And if you look at the query for those that participated in the public comments, it was pretty fascinating to me that just about a third of U.S. medical school students participated in this survey, so a little lower than we had hoped. When you look at their readiness for a change, 44% of the students reported it's time that we look at scoring the USMLE Step 1 and other steps in a way different than we've been doing. If you dissect those students, you'll find that 50% of that 44% are from U.S. medical schools, and international students, or students that have been trained outside of the U.S., prefer the metric that's being used now as a way to help differentiate their competitiveness, their readiness for residency. So we see a division even within the medical student collective body. When we look at student affairs deans, 75% of us believe time is now, because we see the lack of wellness. We see the wear and tear on our learners and the impact it has leading up to and after the exam, not just for the learners, but also for the faculty involved. And so we would like to see change. Whether that change means the same to all of us is not the case, but certainly we agree. When you look at program directors, you'll find that only 26% of them believe there's change is needed in the scoring mechanism. Again, given this pretty small sample of program directors. We have to help our GME counterparts identify students for their programs outside of metrics. It's what undergrad admissions has been doing a phenomenal, or undergraduate medical education admissions has been doing a phenomenal job in. And it's not for a lack of wanting by our GME counterparts. It's work man hours, it's productivity, it's all of the other demands that our GME constituents have to juggle, in addition to reviewing thousands of residency applications for a handful of spots. So there's no easy solution. So I can understand why the percentage is lower there than we'd hope to see. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle depending on the audience, the stakeholders, and will there be a collective voice that I think reaches everyone to a point of satisfaction? Unlikely, but at least the discussion is being had, and those involved are being invited into the discussion. So that's large in part centered around wellness of our students, wellness of our culture of medical school at all across the country. That was largely discussed at the AAMC meeting. The second area that is gaining national attention, and I'll say it's really starting, I think, because of a local voice out of our diversity and inclusion team here, led by Dr. Palermo, and we'll hear a little bit more in her particular debrief, is what do we do for learners once they've arrived in the door? We have phenomenal support to broaden access of medical education to students that maybe a decade or two ago didn't have the opportunity. So through the work of Dr. Parkas and many others on the admissions committee, we bring an exceptionally diverse, talented population of students to this community. It's once they've arrived that we have to be reflective. Are we supporting each of those students to the degree they need supported? And this one size fits all, despite multiple attempts over decades, and I'll even say longer than that for medical education, are we producing the student that's the most authentic student, or are we molding them to be what we want them to be? And there is time for and an opportunity to I think review, be reflective, and bring about change. So when we say student affairs, we often mean these three buckets, at least here at Sinai, and not too differently at other medical schools. So the wellness, the mental health, professional and career development, and then the academic progression. If you were to ask students here, where are we in student affairs? Unfortunately, they see us more in the progression, the disciplinary, the punitive office than somebody there that's to support the medical students throughout their journey. So we have a lot of work to do institutionally to bring about student aid, or student affairs rather, to be more broad than just the perception. But when we look at the work, we really know that our learners are affected by other services and programs that are occurring. So they're, when they come into the door, are we the person or the culture that Dr. Parkas and her team work so hard to recruit? Or is it feeling different? Is there a loss of sense of belongingness as they transition through the door from their undergraduate experience into medical school? When we look at student records and how we manage data, how we use the data to help predict those that may be academic at risk, those that are most successful, can we, close the feedback or provide feedback to the admissions committee so they can keep doing the work that they've been doing and even get better at predicting the student that is a good fit and that has the rigor, the academic horsepower to make it here in our program. And then for some of you in the room, you may have been federal financial aid borrowers. I lived on federal financial aid as a first-generation student. I could not have persisted through graduate school without the assistance. And I'll say that in addition to the academic struggles our students are experiencing, there is the financial struggle that our students experience that comes into the classroom. It's hard to separate your ability to live, to eat, to simply be if you have a concern, and to progress academically if this is a looming concern over your head. And so none of us can get away from these situations that involve student affairs at some point in time. So how can we bridge? How can we unify? How can we align our resources such that the student at the center is our focus? And depending on that student's needs, we're adjusting, we're amenable, we are bending and flexing to meet that student where they need to be met, not where we think that they should be or where we want them to be. So when we look in totality of this model and the conversation gaining great national attention is to coin it to be a holistic student affairs, very much in the same vein that we've had holistic admissions. Now that we've brought in this diverse, talented, rich class, richness in experiences, not financially, what are we doing to support the student individually? And so over the next, I hope, 6 months, 12 months, you'll be hearing more about what Sinai community is doing to lead this effort, and certainly aligning our resources here so that a student can't tell the difference of which office they've walked into. The sense of belonging is everyone's responsibility. And core to this, no matter what office we set, we have a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The lens by which we see the world should be through this equity lens. And so it's not a job that's parked only in diversity and inclusion, but it's a tenet, it's a value, it's foundational to the work that we do in student affairs collectively. So that's a second area that I'm excited to see grow and, again, be led from a Northeast community. And then lastly, in my couple of minutes, I'll just put a plug in and just celebrate our students as they do exit the halls here and enter into graduate medical education training. We've already had 2 rounds of match results, if you will, in some of our earlier match. But March 2020 for the class of 2020. I just find it a lot of fun to say. So it rattles right off the tongue. We are planning with the students giving us some guidance, one heck of a day. I'll say a celebration of their hard work. And really, it's an achievement for the students and for their families and certainly for this community to be a part of that celebration. It won't feel like a celebration without everybody's involvement. And so if you've not already marked this on your calendars, Friday, March 20th is a fun day. Prior to March 20th, our students will learn on Monday, the 16th, whether or not they have matched. And for those that receive unwelcoming news, it is yet another moment in their life where they feel that they have are facing another hurdle. And so through our efforts and support in student affairs to ensure that we can get them placed. For those that are program directors or that have access to program directors, this is when we take all guidance, and this is the time we're going to cash in some favors so that we can ensure that our students are successful in securing a space for their continued training here at Sinai or wherever else that they wish to be. So it's a day that we welcome. We invite you to help celebrate with our students, and more to come as we enter into this. And along with the 30,000 other students that are all vying for similar spots. We hear every year from our residency program itself that there are ample spots for every single U.S. medical student to be successful, and we know that it might not be their number one choice. And so the day of tears and screams and laughter, we never know what emotions those really are, and it's not for us to really care and wonder if that's their first choice. It's just fun to be around that energy and that celebration. So we look forward to sharing that with you in the near future. So I think that's my 10 minutes, and I have to pass the baton, and then certainly we'll have questions at the end. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. First, want to apologize in advance. I have to teach at ASM at 1, and may need to dip out before all the questions are asked. So I just wanted to give you an overview of sort of what lies in the field of diversity and inclusion from my view, largely because I have a national role. I am the chair of the Committee of Student Diversity Affairs, one of 5 committees that makes up the portfolio of the group of Student Affairs. And it's a very robust and active group of a community of medical education leaders and professionals. And so I'm midway through a 3-year term, and one of the core areas of focus we've been advancing through CASDA has been the next best practice, which is holistic student affairs. And all I will say, and just big high five to Tara, just owning it and like taking it on, because we are truly poised here at Sinai to be a pilot school, but also a pioneering school to show it's how it's done and provide guidance to our national community of medical education. So basically, we have been working on this model and working in collaboration across all the committees across the GSA. The GSA leadership has declared it as a priority to move forward. We have an opportunity to present this model and this work to the Council of Deans, which is a very significant stakeholder group. We are also the open plenary for the upcoming March Professional Development Conference for all professionals and group in student affairs. That conference is held in March in Chicago at the end of March. It's co-sponsored by OSR, which is the Organization of Student Representatives and Careers in Medicine. So it's a really much tailored professional development opportunity and is much more richer and I would say more value added than the national meeting. And so we have been really working we've also been invited to hold the pre-conference workshop for that conference. I say all that to say is that it's serious. And what's so great about it is that this is the arc that I think the AAMC is going towards, which is really creating a holistic medical education experience for our students, which ultimately will, I think, extend into holistic postgraduate training. There are already conversations about that as well. In my role, I get to also connect to other groups and inside the GSA portfolio, but also outside the GSA portfolio, and have been able to have an ear into sort of what the upper echelon of leadership is sort of thinking about around diversity and inclusion. So that's sort of what I wanted to present to you today. So David Scorin is the new president of the AAMC, and he spent a lot of time at the LSL to really sort of get to know the peeps, as they say, constituents, and held several town hall meetings. And that's where he launched a strategic planning process. And there was a lot of sort of open, interactive ways to contribute your ideas, not only directly to him, literally email him and or sort of post-it idea submission experience. But there was, out of the LSL, they've spent the last few months organizing and categorizing all the input that they've received. And I wanted to share with you these 4 specific themes that have come out of the input that has been received thus far from the medical education community. And I will say that I think he has a very aggressive plan to actually formalize a strategic plan by April and launch that. I think it's April. And when I met him for the first time at the GSA summer meeting, he said the very first thing he said is number one thing I care about is climate, culture and climate. So my ears perked up. I was like, yes, finally, let's do this. So as you can see here, these are the 4 themes: catalyzing solutions for the biggest challenges facing our community, being the voice of academic medicine and shaping the workforce and develop the people of academic medicine, and being a high-performing, diverse, and inclusive organization. I will say at the town hall meetings, these issues, like very in a smaller way, very specifically came up over and over again. And so there is an email. I'm not sure if it went out. Well, I don't know how it got distributed, but you can get onto the AAMC page. And right now there is an open comment period till January 31st to provide comments on these themes. What does it mean to you when you read this theme? What do you think is missing? And so forth. So feel free to give your input. I also wanted to share some updates around what's happening inside the leadership team of the AAMC, and it appears to me that Dr. Scorin is really going to be solidly partnering with Dr. David Acosta, who's the Chief Diversity Officer of the AAMC. And he recently released a piece that reflects some of the conversations that were happening at the LSM just before that, about really getting academic medical centers to really become equity-minded and conscious, inclusive organizations. These terms I think are fairly kind of new to think about if you have outside of the diversity and inclusion space, because we chew on these terms all the time and think about it all the time, but it's actually sort of taking it out of that space and putting it into the C-suite. And so these are some elements from that I think that is what is evolving this platform that Dr. Scorin will actually co-sign and endorse in his role in the strategic plan. And so what does it mean to be an equity-minded and conscious, inclusive organization? Dr. Acosta calls out these sort of 5 principles, and I am reminded that I think we are actually moving towards that much more further along than many medical schools across the country, largely because of our racism and bias initiative and who we are as people and what we care about. And of course our students. So here is to obviously to proactively educate ourselves as leaders in medical education, educators about the historical context of exclusionary practices in higher education. Those are difficult conversations we've had over the last 5-6 years here at Sinai in MedEd as we've evolved in the RBI. Rejecting the ingrained habit of blaming inequities and failures, and this is where I think Tara was sort of alluding to, on individual students' social, cultural, and educational background, such as MCAT scores or the GPA or the institution they attended. I think Valerie works really hard to undo these sort of snap associations we may have, like you're not good enough because you went to a SUNY school, et cetera. And changing the focus more inwardly to question our institutional effectiveness on student success. And this is like the primary motivation of the holistic student affairs approach, because it aims to be much more structures-based and systematic change. Here, obviously recognizing the elimination of entrenched biases. We do a lot of work around that here in this school and beyond. But I think the next step is really revealing the system onto itself and really calling out how we actually perpetuate structures and practices and policies that are inequitable. And I think that leads to the systems thinking, right? Sometimes we're very linear in our thinking and our approach as leaders. We get into this trap of either or thinking. And I think that as Leona was here, this feels like I'm projecting Leona right now, who oversees our strategy for the RBI, but really thinking about systems change to cause transformative change. And I think lastly, investing time, effort, and social and political capital, and have the courage to begin these discussions. Again, we have, but it's so amazing to me every time I attend these national meetings and I talk about us, how many literally tens and tens of medical schools are not and are stuck and don't know how to move through that. So I find that bittersweet in the sense there's an opportunity for change, but it's also really scary, I guess you could say. So with that, I just wanted to offer this visual that this is really where I think Dr. Scorton and Dr. Acosta are going to be calling out what it means to be, sort of visually illustrate what it means to be an equity-minded, conscious, inclusive organization. If this is their direction, that means that internally they have to also role model this. And what they've done is that they've done an evaluation of all of their, Dr. Scorton has actually done performance measures of his staff around equity. He's asked his staff to actually do performance evaluation of him. He is building in these constructs of equity and inclusion and diversity inside of the performance metrics of his staff and his teams. And so I think that they are seriously taking on being a role model. And all this illustration is intended to do is show these 3 dimensions of diversity, inclusion, excellence, and ultimately leading to an equitable organization. And they have developed a series of toolkits that can assess this, that can assess culture and climate. We're looking to leverage those tools and resources here over time as needed, because in addition to our Office for Diversity and Inclusion having a focus on the medical school, we are also charged for the entire Mount Sinai health system. So we're looking forward to leveraging the work of the AAMC across the health system. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Muneeza. I'm a senior coordinator in the Office of Curriculum Affairs. I'll be talking about health disparities and the role of medical education. So 3 of the sessions that I attended at AAMC, there was a lot of focus on immigration. I did not know this, but Arizona apparently has a really large immigrant population and really huge asylum-seeking population. So there was a lot of interest in that, especially from a medical education point of view. A lot of people from all over the medical field were really partaking in how they can sort of help in this culture and climate to integrate the immigrant population as well as asylum population and some of the issues we have with racism in this country. So 2 of the really big issues that were brought up was housing and segregation, as well as immigration, as I mentioned. One of the things we talked about was that there's no city in the US where Black people live in the equal conditions as white people, which means that they don't have the same job opportunities, they don't have the same quality of education, they don't have safe and affordable housing, nutritious food, good public transportation, quality primary care, and good hospitals and access that are accessible to them. And, something that we talked about was, a patient comes to you with an illness and you treat the patient for that illness and you send them back to the same situations that made them ill in the first place. Here in medical education, we're not really raising social justice warriors. We're trying to groom physicians, but how do you merge the two to the best of your ability to bring the best physicians that can sort of help fix the structures that are ruining people's health? And the second problem was immigration, and I'm going to add to that asylum health. Immigrants have better health outcomes than their US-born counterparts, but the longer that the immigrants stay in the US, the more their health outcome declines. So that's really something to think about, that what are we doing wrong here in the US? And then another thing that's come up in the recent administration is there are a lot of asylum seekers that are being sent back to their countries of origin. Their lives are in danger. We have a lot who are killed as soon as they return. And physicians really want to get involved in how they can help. And one of the things discussed was asylum seekers need their health evaluated, so they're coming to physicians, but there are not enough physicians who are trained to do this. So there's a responsibility here in medical education to kind of highlight that for our students. I mean, we're not making it mandatory, but how can they be better trained to evaluate asylees and their health? It's like, there's like certain lawyer language that they're not used to. There's a lot of health issues that are completely new. And how do you best process that paperwork that shows that, yes, this person should not be returned to the country where they're in danger? So there were some other curricular solutions that were brought up in the various sessions I attended, so I'm sort of like bringing them all together here. Raising awareness, so the knowledge of these issues. How do you raise that awareness in physicians and our students? I like to think that a lot of the suggestions here are things that we work on here at Mount Sinai, especially in the InFocus curriculum, in ASM curriculum, and also divided across the 4-year curriculum. So increasing the knowledge of various issues of racism and bias, training students to ask the right questions. An example that was brought up was that there was an 89-year-old patient that kept coming into this emergency room, and he was constantly deemed as non-compliant, and the physicians kept getting frustrated that, we're writing down all the instructions that he can do to take care of himself, and he seems really agreeable, and then he goes back, doesn't do anything, and comes back in a couple of weeks. Upon asking the correct questions, and a social worker was involved, they learned that the patient couldn't read. So no matter how many instructions you wrote down, that was not going to happen. And then on asking even more questions, they learned that he was actually eligible for a home aid. And the physicians completely missed that for a full year. So how do we train our students to ask the right questions and to think of the right questions when dealing with certain patients? And then obviously also giving students the knowledge of the various resources that are available not only in the hospital system, but maybe in the city they work in. For example, in New York City, you can complain to 311 if you don't have like heating and gas in your apartment. Our physicians and our students should be sort of aware of these things that they can lead these patients towards. And all of that kind of works towards improving the patient-physician relationship. One thing that we discussed was, we're all a little bit biased, unfortunately. It might just be the way we were raised. It's the environment that we grew up in. It's the environment we live in today. So the first step is to be aware of what we have within us in terms of biases. So working with our students on that, and again, I like to think that Sinai is doing a fairly decent job with all the different initiatives we've taken in our curriculum and otherwise. Another really interesting activity that's happening at the University of Michigan in Detroit is, Detroit has a huge immigrant population, and they bring their immigrant patients from various parts of the world to come speak to their students at different points of their education in those 4 years. And they sort of talk about how they interact with the healthcare system. So in their home countries, the healthcare systems are different. Some people, they don't have to make an appointment, they just kind of turn up. Some people turn up 4 hours after their appointment. It's just the way the system works. So learning from these patients about how they interact and what they expect of a health system really helped these students learn what to expect and how not to grow, almost frustrated with some of their patients, and maybe to understand from their patient's point of view what's really going on with them. But also giving these students access to teachers, to mentors, people who are better experienced and aware and are willing to talk to them and help them out in these situations. The other point would be advocacy skills, teaching our students the right advocacy skills to advocate for their patients. One of the interesting debates that came up within one of my sessions was, hospitals, teaching hospitals, especially something like Mount Sinai that's located in a low-income zip code. We tend to we have our students going out and volunteering in the field, and that's a really great thing because they're a resource to this community. But to what extent are we actually harming this community by just volunteering and using them as an example for our students to learn on? how can we improve that? How can we make our students and our physicians advocates for these people to actually improve the system and not just keeping the system at the level that it is? So that was really discussed. The last point here is the divine solution, which I thought was a really interesting study conducted by Dr. Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this study looked at racism and bias as something that's like a deeply ingrained habit within us, and how do we break that habit? So I thought that would be, just kind of taking an example from this study and using that sort of to integrate into our curriculum, is you increase awareness of the bias within you, and in this case it was used within a Black population, and then increase the concerns that you have of the effect of the bias, not about with you as a person, but within a larger community. And then implementing multiple strategies to reduce that bias. So some of those strategies were sort of, if you meet a patient and you just sort of, see the color of their skin or their gender or anything, and suddenly you have this like sudden prejudice against them. You need to stop yourself and think about, why did I think that way? And where did that come from? And how do I stop it? And then putting yourself in the shoes of that patient, like why did they react like that? Or why did I react like that? But also increasing your exposure to people of different populations that you're not used to and you may have certain biases towards. So that was some really interesting strategies that I read about. And the study itself showed that there was an effective reduction in bias, and it went on. It was like a long-term reduction, and they had a control group as well, which showed absolutely no reduction. So they really thought that this was a pretty good study in that sense. Some other solutions that were a little outside of curriculum was making the mission of the school more visible during the application admissions process. I like to think that Sinai does do that, but it helps attract students that are actually genuinely in line with your mission. So, our school's mission is a lot towards social justice. We really want to bring students who are not going to come in and be like, this is not medicine, this is not what we wanted to study. The second point, which is also really interesting, is embedding policies into normal operations, so that when your leadership switches and your leadership that used to be really interested in is now replaced by someone who isn't, there's not much disruption in the education towards these things. And the third, which I believe a lot of physicians are probably going to agree with, is there's so much focus on research and getting published in teaching hospitals that students and physicians don't really want to do advocacy work or work that's beyond just being published. So trying to shift away from that culture would really help. So, thank you.
Hello, I'm Valerie. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Admissions here at Sinai. I'm actually just going to talk about one talk that I went to. I went to a number of talks on admissions and a lot of topics, but I thought this was an interesting one to share, and it was called Athletes into Medicine and Science Collaboration. So it was under a big group of a breakout session that I went to called Charting New Territories to Increase Diversity in Medicine. And this was one of 4 talks. And this one was done by Lydia Bell, who is the Associate Director of Research and Academic Performance at the NCAA, actually. And she talked about Athletes into Medicine and Science initiative. And the objective today is to understand this collaborative initiative and specifically some of the data underpinning the initiative and the plans going forward. So let me just take a step back to give a little bit of background. There was a recent summit here in June led by Reg Miller, who I'm sure everyone in the room knows, really about increasing sort of STEM field, science careers, medicine careers for athletes. And I had the privilege, and I think other people in the room were also involved, of being the moderator on a panel for a number of our students in both the grad school and the med school who are athletes, consider themselves athletes and were athletes at the collegiate level prior to coming to graduate school and medical school. And so that was sort of about thinking through, is this a cohort of folks, right, a very heterogeneous cohort, but a cohort of folks that we can begin to mentor and bring up through the pipeline. And so Dr. Miller did this session, and in conjunction with that, sort of not basically at the same time, we have had a lot of conversations at the admissions committee, and there's a lot of folks here on the admissions committee here about athletes and about thinking, as we think holistically about the applications, a lot of the attributes that we are looking for, such as commitment and dedication and being able to sort of multitask and resilience and grit and teamwork and leadership, and a lot of the attributes that we look for are displayed through really high-level extracurricular activities, including athletics and other ones as well. But should we be looking at this cohort? So both of those things were sort of happening, so I decided to go to this talk and listen to Dr. Bell. So the early collaborative effort between the NCAA, the NIH, and the AAMC, so those are big players with this collaboration. Their goals are to enhance academic preparation of student athletes interested in medicine or biomedical research, to build student athletes' confidence in pursuing a career in medicine or biomedical research, to increase knowledge about the pathways to medicine and biomedical research, to learn how to leverage athletics experience to advance a career development, and to expand the network of peers, coaches, mentors, and role models who will foster success for this cohort. So a lot of this data that I'm going to show you is the data that she showed us. So it's not my data. Some of the terms might not be the exact terms that we would use here, but I thought it was slightly interesting and kind of big players to have an initiative. And I have reached out to her, to Dr. Bell, to see if we also can have some role. And of course, I think Dr. Miller has put Sinai on, in their sphere, and he's very much involved with them at a high level, much more so than I am. So why target NCAA student athletes for a career in science and medicine? So this was, again, her data, but student athlete demographics, right? So male student athletes, it's a very, very racially and ethnically diverse group. Female student athletes the same, right? And so this is a diverse group, and if we can start getting them to think about their next step with all those attributes that I just mentioned already being a part of them, we would end up with folks, physician body, more diverse science workforce, and a more diverse student body. So this is data that she showed, and this is asking the student athletes. My athletics experience has had a positive effect on the following, right? Again, personal responsibility, work ethic, teamwork, goal setting, attention to detail, leadership skills, dealing with change, time management, understanding different races and backgrounds, self-confidence, and a commitment to the community, right? So all attributes that we care deeply about, so it makes sense. Elements of well-being, right? So when you ask student athletes versus non-athletes about purpose, about well-being socially, about financial well-being, community well-being, physical well-being, the numbers are not as high as we want them to be for students, but they're higher for student athletes, still need to be higher, than they are for non-athletes, right? So again, a lot of the attributes that we were just talking about in Holistic Student Affairs model are seen in this survey. So what do the student athletes go into compared to the student body? And there seems to be a discrepancy with STEM, right? So if you look at STEM, student athletes 7% versus 22% for the total student body. So there seems to be, particularly around STEM, a sense in the athletes, despite all these wonderful attributes, that this is not the career they can go into. Part of that is simply structure, right? Having looked at a lot of colleges with my kids, both of whom are athletes, the labs conflict with the practice, and it's like done. You can't do both. And so we need to begin thinking of not only structural things like that, but bigger things about professional identity, about their identity as an academic and an athlete, as a scholar athlete, and sort of being able to sort of demystify STEM fields, because again, these are the attributes that we want. So what are the areas for collaborative programming? Forging deeper connections between the NCAA and the AAMC institutions to identify faculty and physician mentors for current NCAA student athletes. Targeting student athletes for summer research opportunities in STEM, right? Sort of making it part of the program, having those mentors and coaches think about that and think about how athletes can do that. Enhancing the understanding of medical pathways and undergraduate post-bac coursework for medical school applicants among athletics academic advisors, right? So even just having the advisors and mentors think about it, expanding opportunities to gain access to pre-med advising and resources, leveraging the strong interest in STEM fields among Black student athletes at the 53 HBCU NCAA institutions to deepen the pool, identifying current MDs and medical researchers who are former student athletes and telling their stories to generate enthusiasm and increase knowledge about the pathways to medicine and biomedical research. So what are we doing nationally and locally? So Dr. Miller really led this SWAG Summit, which it was called, with New York City scholar athletes. There were a lot of kids in the pipeline who came to the summit. They came with their parents. They were sort of starting to think about themselves being a scholar athlete and then being in STEM. The keynote speaker was Dr. Valentine, who was the NIH Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, building a network. And what are we doing here in admissions? So we're very holistic, right? And we very much think about the entire portfolio. However, you also have to understand what that student did. So if that student was spending this much time, on the water or on the court or on the field or whatever the sport is, then you have to sort of think through, okay, do they have a little less clinical exposure? Is that okay? Do they have a little bit less research exposure? Is that okay? Right, they probably can't have no clinical exposure, right? Then we're certainly not being holistic, but at least educating the committee. We have put in our identifiable fields on our screening form athlete, and that doesn't just mean a little like going to the gym like I might do, but really an athlete, right? So committee education, putting identifiable fields so we can pull folks out, and then thinking about scholarship. Is it true? We believe that they have these characteristics and attributes that are going to lead them to success, but we need to do the data. We need to look at the scholarship. There is one ENT literature where they looked at into GME, and the athletes ended up with very, very good success upon graduation from an ENT program. But that's one small study. So if we think that this is really a way to diversify the field and to also bring in folks who have attributes that we want, we have to look at the data and see their success. But I thought it was a pretty interesting new initiative that I had not previously thought about. I will also say, since we spend a lot of time talking about unconscious bias, I was a Division I athlete in college, and so I think my team will smile at me and sort of make sure I'm not having this unconscious bias, right, where I'm like, oh, he's an athlete. I mean, we don't have a basketball team here. We don't have a sailing team, right? So we're not only just trying to bring in athletes, we're doing holistic review. But if that is a cohort where we can help them believe in themselves that they can do this, I think we will have opened up our field to even a more diverse pool of applicants. So it's worth thinking about. Thank you.